In this program, we're going to look at two of the most famous laws of physics that have ever existed. They are Newton's first and Newton's second laws of motion. You'll have come across them a lot in all your physics lessons. And Newton's first and second laws of motion tell us two things. They tell us what does a force do, and they tell us how much effect a force has. Well, you may remember Newton's first law tells you about force changing movement. And Newton's second law then tells us how much force will cause how much change. But before we go on to Newton's second laws, you notice the word force comes in each law. Let me just say a word about what a force is. Well, it's a very, very common word, force. And the point is that force is something that causes change. Now, the change can be two sorts of change. First of all, a force can change the shape of an object. So if I take an ordinary school eraser here and exert a force on it, I can change the shape of the eraser. If I take an egg and if I exert a big force on it with my fingers, the egg breaks. The shape of the egg changes. Well, now, I'm going to exert a very, very big force because I'm going to drop this egg on the ground. And I hope the camera can follow the egg as it goes down and hits the ground. What do you think is going to happen? Ready? This egg, it didn't break because it's a rubber egg. But nevertheless, when it hit the ground, the rubber was pushed in, just like when you hit a tennis ball with a racket. The ball is pushed in. Or if you kick a football, where your foot hits the football is pushed in. So this rubber egg, the shape changed, but not in the way you might have expected. The egg didn't break. The egg simply got compressed. So force can change shape. Sometimes small forces make a small change in shape. Bigger forces make a bigger change in shape. And here we have an example of bending a solid iron bar. This is one of these bars that goes in reinforced concrete, and they have to be bent. And so there is a very simple little device here for exerting a big force on the bar, and it causes iron to bend. You can see how much force is required. So I can now look at this iron bar, and I have changed its shape by applying a very big force to it. I can break an egg by applying a small force to it. So number one, force can cause the shape of something to change. An elastic band, the length of the band changes. Changing shape. Now, the second thing that force can do is to cause a change in movement. And you know Newton's second law, you'll remember, says that if an object is not moving, then you need a force to make it start moving. And Newton also said, and this is very important, if an object is moving, like a car going along the road, you need a force to change the movement. Now, changing the movement can mean slowing down, can mean speeding up, or it can mean changing direction. as when you go round a corner. So let's just summarize. Newton's first law tells us that if an object is not moving, you need a force to make it move. And it tells us that if an object is moving, like a car going down the road, you have to have a force to change the movement. The car, if it wanted to stop, would have to apply a force using the brakes. So, what is a force? A force causes change. Change of shape or change of movement. Well, we'll look a little bit more about some of that in a moment, but if I'm going to say a force is big or a force is small, I have to have a way of measuring the force. So, how do we measure force? Well, we measure force in the standard international, the SI system of units. We measure force in units called newtons, named after our old friend Isaac Newton. So, how big is 1 newton of force? Let's look at this little packet of raisins. I bought this just now in the grocery shop. It's 100 grams, that's the mass of the raisins. But I have to hold it up against the force of gravity. If I hold up that packet of raisins, my fingers are using a force of 1 newton to hold up that packet of raisins. So if ever you want to know how big a newton is, think of this little packet of raisins. That's 1 newton of force. And in the grocery shop, I also got myself a tin of tuna. And this tin of tuna, to hold it up against gravity, I have to use a force of 2 newtons. So this gives you an idea of how big a newton is. A newton is quite a small unit. If I exerted that sort of force to kick a football, it might go 1 yard across the ground. So a newton is a small unit. If I take my cup of coffee here, this cup of coffee, to hold it up, I have to use a force of about 5 or 6 newtons. Well now, if we think of a big object that I want to move, let's think about the Drucker Airbus or a British Airways Airbus. If I want to move that, I need a much bigger force. No point having 1 newton. I need, in order to make the Airbus accelerate down the runway, I need a very big force. Newton's second law tells us all about how much force you need to make something accelerate by how much. First law tells us what the force does. Second law tells us how much force to do how much change. So, if we think of an aeroplane taking off, you listen to the roar of the engine. The power, the force coming out of those small engines, they're not big, each engine producing a force. So we remember force can change the shape of an object. So when I've finished my drink on this lovely day, I can simply squeeze and change the shape of the drinks can. And then, of course, I have to be very careful to throw my drinks can in the waste bin. And in order to do that, I'm using Newton's second law and first law, which tell me to make it move, I have to use a force, and I have to use the right amount of force to get it in the waste bin. Another area where an understanding of Newton's laws is absolutely essential is in almost every sort of sport. Now, if you think about it, when you're playing football, you've got a ball there, and you're going to use your foot to kick it. Well, what that actually means, you're going to use your force, your foot, to apply a force to the football. Now, if you want the football to go in the goal, you've got to use the right amount of force, and you've got to use the force in the correct direction. If you get the amount of force wrong, or if you get the direction wrong, you will not be a good footballer. And David Beckham may not be able to repeat out of the top of his head Newton's laws of motion, but believe me, to be a good footballer like he is, you need to have an intuitive understanding of the effects of force on the ball that you're kicking around. Now, football, basketball, exactly the same thing. You go for a net and you've got to use the right amount of force in the right direction. And golf, if we look at golf, the golfer has got to hit that ball a long way using a heavy iron club. And he's got to use the right amount of force in the right direction. And off goes the ball, hopefully for a hole-in-one if our Bhutanese Tiger Woods here is as good as he usually is. So any sort of sport involves an understanding of force and an understanding of Newton's laws of motion. Running, you have to know when to exert a big force, when to exert a little force. Cricket, with the bat, you're changing the motion of the ball. You think about it. Every sport requires an understanding of Newton's laws. I'm going to finish my coffee and go for a little drive, because another area of everyday life where we really have to understand Newton's laws is when we drive. Because when we drive, we want to accelerate our car, we want to decelerate it, and we want to go round corners. In other words, we want to change the movement of our car. Newton's first and second laws tell us all about changing the movement of our car. So let's go for a drive. Newton's laws in action all the time. Whenever we're driving, we have to have a very good idea of Newton's laws in our mind. For example, here we come to a roundabout. I need to slow down the car, but I also need to make its direction change. And so the road has to exert a force to make the direction of travel of the car turn to the right. So we need a force. And Newton's second law tells us how much force we need. Here we are on the expressway, and you notice there is supposed to be a speed limit of 50 kilometers an hour. Why do we need a speed limit on a nice wide road like this? Well, remember, every time we go round a corner, the road has to exert on the force on the car to make it change its direction. Now, the faster I'm going, the bigger the force has to be. And if I go too fast, I may not make it around the corner, because the road's force pushing me round may not be big enough. So even on a nice wide road, we have a speed limit. And on the expressway here, there are many corners where I'm using a force to change the direction of movement of the car. So now we're on quite a straight bit of the expressway. So why do we need a speed limit here? No corners to go round. Well, sometimes I have to stop. And I stop the car by applying the brakes, which apply a force to make it stop. Now, if I'm going too fast, the force will not be big enough to decelerate the car sufficiently. But also there's another point. You look at my passenger. What happens to my passenger if I suddenly brake? Did you see that? I'm going to do it again at great risk to my passenger. Watch. I'm going to suddenly slow down. Now, if you think about it, here we have Newton's first law. To make him slow down, as the car was doing, I needed a force, but the passenger was just sitting in his seat. There wasn't any force to cause him to slow down. So what can we do? Let's attach him to the motor car with a seat belt. And now he's attached to the car. If I slow down, the seat belt exerts a force to hold him in his seat. Here I go, I'm going to slow down. And instead of going forwards and banging his head on the windscreen, and indeed, if I had been going faster, he would have gone straight out through the windscreen. Now, the seat belt holds him safely in his seat. Well, where are we now? We've come to the workshops in Simtoka. And we've come here because I want to show you what happens if, when you are driving, you pay no attention to Newton's laws. So, here we are at the workshops, and as we come and have a little look, let me remind you that a force can change the shape of an object. With the force of my hand, I can change the shape of my drinks can. And the thing about road traffic is this: the forces are much bigger, and they can change the shape of your car, your truck, your four-wheel drive. It can end up in a very different shape than what you hoped for when you first bought it. So we've just seen what can happen to you and to your car if you're driving without a good understanding of forces and Newton's first and second laws. Well, now, let's just think one moment more about the forces involved when you're driving. I've said already, Newton's laws of motion are really important when it comes to driving. If we think about Newton's third law, to every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. Now, let's look down here. Let's look at the place where the tyre touches the road. Now, when we start the engine and make the wheel turn, the wheel is pushing backwards on the road. If we had sand here, the sand would be pushed backwards. There's no sand. There's good, solid road surface. The wheel pushes backwards on the road surface. That's the action. But what does the road surface do? The road surface pushes forwards. The wheel pushes back, the road surface pushes forwards, and it's that forwards reaction of the road surface that makes the car move forward. So we have a very good example of Newton's third law: action and reaction. action of the rubber on the tyre on the road, the reaction of the road pushing the tyre forwards. Without Newton's third law, this car would never go anywhere. And now this is Arun, an instructor with one of the driving schools in Thimphu, and he's going to get in and make the car go forwards. And as he starts the car, I want you to think of Newton's 3 laws. First one, you need a force to make the car move. Second one, the heavier the car, the bigger the force you need. And the third one, action and reaction are equal and opposite. All those 3 laws coming into play when Arun drives off. Thank you, Arun, for the loan of your motor car. You know, exactly the same thing applies for Newton's laws when we want to stop a car. And when you apply the brakes, let's just think about what's happening between the tyres and the road when you put the brakes on. We've got Newton's 3 laws coming into action again. First of all, we remember Newton's first law: to change the movement of the car, we need a force. To stop the car, we need a force. Newton's second law: the heavier the car, the bigger the force we need. And Newton's third law, action and reaction, well, this time the brakes are trying to make the wheel stop, so the rubber is pushing forwards on the ground. That's the action. The reaction is the ground pushing backwards on the wheels. And it's the reaction pushing backwards of the ground on the wheels that makes the car stop. And if I tried braking on icy ground, then there's no reaction from the ground. The rubber just slips over the ice. There's no backwards reaction. And instead of stopping, the car continues on and bangs into the wall. So, in starting and stopping the car, Newton's 3 laws. In turning a corner with the car, Newton's 3 laws all come into action as well. So I hope you remember, every time you get in a car, think about Newton's 3 laws of motion. And I'm standing beside this beautifully decorated, great big 12-ton truck. Now, I've said to you that Newton's second law says force equals mass times acceleration. The bigger the mass of an object, the bigger the force you need to make it accelerate. And that's very obvious with this. 12 tons, 12,000 kilograms. It requires a big force to accelerate this truck. And that's why these trucks have such great big diesel engines. It requires a very big force. Now, it requires a big force to accelerate this truck, and the driver here knows that there's no point him trying to race a Mercedes-Benz because the truck needs so much force he can't get very big acceleration. So the driver of one of these trucks knows perfectly well that he needs a big force to stop the truck as well. So he's got brakes which are power assisted and sometimes make a lot of noise, because just as Newton's second law tells you about accelerating something, so also it tells you about decelerating something. A big mass requires a big force. Well, now I see coming just alongside us here another vehicle. And this vehicle is being driven by a young lady who I think must be learning to drive. So I'm going to get her to come here. But because she's learning, I'm going to move out of the way a bit. Let's get the lady to stop here. Just a bit more. Well done. Stop. Now. Hello. What's your name?
My name is Kadim.
Kadim. Hello. Kadim, how long have you been learning to drive?
Almost 2 months.
2 months. Very good. So another month and it'll be time to take your test. Now, what I want you to look at is this car and that truck. It's a little bit like young lady driver and great big muscle man driver of the truck. The car is about 2 tons. The truck is about 12 tons. 6 times more massive. The force required to accelerate this car is about 6 times less than the force required to accelerate the truck. But if I were to put the 2 drivers into their car and get them to have a race and stand here and say, ready, steady, go, the car would accelerate quicker than the truck because the force to accelerate it is much less. Force equals mass multiplied by acceleration. Now, I mentioned the truck driver knows he needs a big force to stop the car. And our new driver, Kadim here, will know and must remember during all her driving life that stopping a vehicle is difficult. Newton's second law, force equals mass times acceleration, also applies if you're trying to slow a car down. You need much more force to stop this truck than to stop this car. Now, that's obvious, isn't it? Why am I standing here telling you what is absolutely obvious? This needs a big force, this needs a small force. Well, the lovely thing about physics is simple everyday life. Newton's second law, force equals mass times acceleration, we come across every moment of our lives. So there's nothing very complicated about it. We simply have to think about mass, the force required to accelerate the truck, the force required to accelerate the car. We've got Newton's second law in front of us here. Thank you, Kadim, very much indeed, and very good luck with your driving. And truck driver, thank you very much indeed. Big force, small force.